What are some solved mysteries? The Siberian craters. As the permafrost melts, the methane gas gets released and it sometimes ignites. The disappearance of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, author of The Little Prince, who was also a French reconnaissance pilot during World War II. In 1944, he took off on a reconnaissance mission from Corsica and never made it back, and there was never any evidence of what might have happened to him and his plane. Finally, in 1998, a French fisherman pulled up his net and found wrapped in it a silver bracelet engraved with Saint-Exupéry's name. And in 2004, a diver searched in the area and found the remains of his plane, which had apparently been shot down by a German fighter after all. The Windsor hum. Residents of Windsor, Canada, have been saying they could hear a hum coming from across the river in Detroit for the better part of a few decades. Well, turns out that when a steel producer turned their furnaces off recently, when they were closing up shop, the hum stopped. People had no idea what the noise could be until the factory closed. Edit. Also a little fun fact, Zug Island, where the factory was located, was mentioned in RoboCop and was also the destination of the SS Edmund Fitzgerald before it sank. Dan Rather was attacked and beaten on a New York street by two men who kept demanding, "What's the frequency, Kenneth?" He was rescued by a doorman, and the two guys got away. For years, no one knew who they were. Then a man invaded NBC studios and killed a stagehand. When captured, he explained that the networks were beaming radio messages into his head. He wanted to know the frequency they were using so he could jam the signals. Dan Rather was shown a mugshot and positively identified his attacker. Here's a New York Times article on it. NY Times. The 30th of January 1997, NY region, belatedly the riddle of an attack on Rather assault. HTML. Devil's Kettle Falls. A stream separates into two sections. One continues normally, the other spirals deep into a hole. All sorts of things were thrown down the hole in an effort to discover where the water went. Ping pong balls, various dyes. It was even rumored that someone stuck an old car down there. Eventually someone came up with a clever idea. They measured the total water flow above and below the falls and discovered they were similar enough to deduce the two streams joined back up relatively quickly. Edit. Source. NPR.org. Story. The 28th of February 2017, hydrologists solved Minnesota Devil's Kettle Falls mystery. Also, I guess fun bonus, I first learned of the mystery from Reddit and it has since been solved. Forrest Fenn's hidden treasure chest that he buried years ago and left clues to where to find its location. It was found within the last 2 years, I think. Here's a link to an article better explaining it. Reddit.com/r unresolved mysteries, comments, GYMLM6, Forrest Fenn announces his treasure has been found. UTM source equals share and UTM medium equals IOSAP and UTM name equals IOSSMF. The missing feet murders. For many years, human feet kept washing up on the shores near Seattle and Vancouver. A total of 21 were found. Naturally, people thought there was a murderer afoot. And their modus operandi was to cut their victims' feet off before disposing of the body in the ocean. Turns out many of the remains were deemed as suicides. Turns are when you jump off one of the many bridges Seattle and Vancouver has to offer, your body decomposes, and your limbs detach. The foam and floaty material in the victims' shoes ensured their feet would float and get caught in tidal currents, this dispersing the detached feet nicely. Case closed. The Erebus and the Terror were found a few years ago. The two ships were part of an Arctic expedition and disappeared 150 years ago. Wikipedia.org, Wiki, Franklin percent 27's Lost Expedition. The Sailing Stones of Death Valley. 1. National Parks. Org, Connect, Blog, Sailing Stones Death Valley. Video here. 2. YouTube. B, 89AFHIEDPM. TLDR. Rocks would magically move up to 1,500 feet in the desert. Turns out it gets cold and freezes the ground overnight and the rocks would get pushed by the ice sheets that melted under the wind. The case of Adrienne Shelley, screenwriter for Waitress. Husband came home to find her hanging in the shower, ruled suicide. He insists she was happy and would never kill herself, promoting another view of crime scene where they found a shoe print that matched a construction worker in the building. Sure enough, the construction worker went to rob her and thought he killed her, so staged a suicide when the hanging ended up being the actual thing that killed her. N.M. Wikipedia.org, Wiki, Adrienne Shelley. The Bloop. TLDR. In 1997 a really weird and loud noise was detected underwater and everyone was all, WTF was that? In 2012 it was determined it was an iceberg breaking and/or rubbing against the seabed. Benjamin Kyle. Man found beaten behind a Burger King with severe amnesia. It was a fascinating mystery until it was solved. Then it was kind of sad. He had made TV appearances. had a couple of AMAs on Reddit, but no one could identify him. When his identity was discovered, William Burgess Powell, there was still a 20-year gap in his life from 1984 to 2004. There's no record he had done anything. He had distanced himself from his family and had no friends, which is why no one recognized or identified him from his TV appearances. Mark Felt was Deep Throat, the key source for the journalists that pursued the Watergate story. While it doesn't give us who the Zodiac Killer is, just recently his most infamous 340 cipher was solved after 51 years. What Daenerys looked like. When I was a kid in the 80s, all that was known were the bones of the arms with enormous claws. Hence its name, Terrible Hand. They were mostly shown grasping a small car because they were so freaking huge. The rest of the animal was a complete mystery. Was it like a giant Allosaurus? One that'd make the T-Rex look like a puppy in comparison? A few years later it seemed more likely to be ostrich-like and an omnivore. Either way, given how rare it is for fossils to form at all, I was convinced I'd die never knowing what this dinosaur actually looked like. Then surprisingly in 2014, they found more bones and it was just the weirdest thing. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Daenerys. The Solway Spaceman. In 1964, Jim Templeton, a fireman from the English city of Carlisle, was spending an afternoon out with his family when he snapped a photograph of his young daughter without much thought. But when he got home and had the film developed, he noticed what has now become known as the Solway Spaceman. The photo shows what many people say is a person in some form of spacesuit. Kodak even analyzed the photo and their experts said it was authentic, lending to the spaceman theory. The spaceman was his wife with her back to the camera. He was only able to see 70% of the frame and didn't realize his wife was in the background of the picture. El Dorado, or the Lost City of Gold, turned out to be a mistranslation. It was just the name of some guy that got mistranslated to the name of a city. In the 1970s, a number of Japanese citizens disappeared from coastal areas in Japan. After many years it was found out that North Korea had abducted them. North Korean abductions of Japanese citizens. Edit. Megumi Yokota. Most of the missing were in their 20s. The youngest, Megumi Yokota, was 13 when she disappeared in November 1977, from the Japanese west coast city of Niigata. What's the purpose of the appendix really? It keeps your good bacteria safe. Not so much a mystery, but Fermat's last theorem lacked general proof for several hundred years, until Andrew Wiles provided one in 1995. Where is the Titanic? Most people don't realize that half of the people in the world grew up when the ship's location was still a complete mystery. Now, it's old news. Weeping Jesus statue in India mystery. Apparently a Jesus statue started crying and all Christians along with Hindus started to drink it. It turned out to be sewage. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Weeping crucifix in Mumbai. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Disappearance of Corey McKeague. This one is strange. A guy is out drinking with friends late at night and leaves. He starts wandering the streets, and a CCTV sees him enter a cul-de-sac. Then he's never seen again. Some think there is foul play, since an accidental death would at least result in a body. But then family and friends reveal that he had a very strange habit of sleeping in garbage bins when he was drunk. A few hours after he entered the cul-de-sac, the garbage truck came and picked up the bins. Later, after looking at the logs, it turns out that one bin weighed several hundred pounds more than it should have. But that was only recognized after it was too late. Memories of Murder. A movie based on true story about South Korea's first serial murderer. A confession was made in 2019 after more than 30 years. He was already in jail for raping and killing his sister-in-law. Go check the movie. It's a masterpiece. I have one that most people seem to not know about. Grand Duchess Anastasia was in fact killed with the rest of her family in 1918. She never escaped, and the several women throughout the 20th century claiming to be her lied. The site of the execution of the Tsar and his family was completely untouched until 1991. Excavation found only 9 of the 11 expected remains. It wasn't until 2007 that 2 further sets of remains were found a small distance away from the previous gravesite. DNA testing found that one of the sets of remains belonged to Tsarevich Alexei and the other to one of his sisters. With this find, it proved conclusively that the entire imperial family was in fact executed and buried in 1918. The Pioneer gravity anomaly. Space probe wasn't accelerating away from Earth the way we'd predicted. But it didn't get noticed until the probe got way the frock out there. Next space probe gets launched, gets way out there. Same thing happens. WTF? How does acceleration not work right? Does gravity just change really far away? Turns out the heat from the radioactive death generator was all coming off the same side of the space probe, and the extra particle radiation gave a thermal recoil force, resulting in an extra acceleration of, no kidding, about 0.00000000874 meter per square second, over enough distance, it all counts. The prophet hen of Leeds. A hen was laying eggs with messages like, "Christ is coming," and people thought the world was ending. Turned out the farmer was actually writing on the eggs herself, and then reinserted it back into the chicken. Edited for gender of the farmer. Molyneux's problem. If a man born blind can feel the differences between shapes such as spheres and cubes, could he, if given the ability to see, distinguish those objects by sight alone? In reference to the tactile schemata he already possessed? The answer is no. Mary Toft. I mean, really, what the frock? TLDR. NSFW. Woman starts giving birth to copious amounts of rabbit parts. Woman taken to London and studied under intense supervision. Turns out she was shoving the pieces up there days before for the publicity. Human spontaneous combustion, not a real thing. It's where there was an overlooked source of ignition. Then subcutaneous fat is absorbed into clothing and acts like a wick. Basically they're a human candle. Edit. You might find this interesting. YouTube. B. Silv OCBXI1C. The Tomb of Jesus. Previously unknown brother turned out to be a hoax to try to sell the tomb of a nobody for a lot of money. Not exactly solved, as there's no 100% confirmation. But the whole, what's the main buyer of glitter, craze from a while back, turns out it's highly likely, basically confirmed emo, that it's boat paint, just boat paint. When surveying a bay in Alaska from the air in the 1950s, the geologists on board noticed that the tree line was different several hundred feet above sea level, almost as if a tsunami had washed the trees away at one point. Problem was a tsunami of this size had never been recorded, or though possible, only a few years later a rock slide occurred in that same bay causing a 1,700 feet wave. Here is a link. I think this is from that event. N.M. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki, 1958 Lituya Bay earthquake and megatsunami. Edit. The 1,720 feet was measured on land. That was the highest point the wave hit. On the bay the wave would not have been this high. Bermuda Triangle, Devil's Sea. A triangle-shaped section of ocean where airplanes and boats were known to disappear. Apparently most stories were embellished, and there is so much traffic that goes through the area it's actually a very small amount of vessels that go missing, percentage-wise. The story of the Toynbee tiles always fascinated me. In the 1980s all these tiles started to appear in major cities across the US. Mostly around Philadelphia. They were laid in the ground, in the middle of the streets, and no one knew how they appeared there. They had strange messages. Toynbee idea in Kubrick's 2001 Resurrect Dead on Planet Jupiter. There's an amazing documentary about this guy who noticed the tiles and went on a quest to figure out how they were appearing and who was creating them. The tiles are actually in the asphalt, which is not an easy feat. In the doc, Justin Dewar finds the guy and figures out how he does it with a car that has no passenger seat and a hole in the bottom. It's a beautifully heartbreaking story and I highly recommend watching it. The true identity of Benjamin Kyle. The guy who had amnesia after being found unconscious in a Burger King dumpster. Genetic research discovered his real name was William Burgess Powell. His story is still pretty crazy, as it was discovered that at some point in his life he had abandoned his family and all of his possessions to live on his own. And there are still no official records of him for the 20 years prior to him being discovered in the dumpster. N.M. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Benjamin Kyle. The Marfa Mystery Lights. Small town in West Texas has lights that can be seen dancing off the horizon in a certain spot some nights. For many years the source of the light was not known and explanations ranged from mass hysteria to the ever-popular UFO. One researcher finally figured it out. The elevation changes and desert air would occasionally combine to distort and project headlights from cars on a highway several miles away. Reports of the mystery lights from times prior to the highway or automobiles are probably campfires in the general area of the highway. Like many highways, the area was already used as a road for quite a long time. Christine Jessup. Christine was a 9-year-old Canadian girl from Queensville, Ontario who was abducted, raped, and murdered in October 1984. Her body was found about 50 kilometers, 31 miles, from her home, in Durham region on New Year's Eve of the same year. On October 15, 2020, police officials announced that using a new technique for tracing criminals through the DNA of their relatives, they had concluded Jessup was killed by Calvin Hoover. Whether the city of Troy really existed or was just legend, it did. Some German guy who got rich in early industrialization used his wealth to search for it. Pretty much all the scholars of the time said it was a fool's errand. Then he actually found it. Lori Erica Ruff committed suicide after her husband left her. While going through her effects he found that she had been using a fake identity. No one could find her true identity for years until just recently. In January of 1993, a 14-year-old girl I went to high school with was abducted on her way to school, murdered, and left denuded in a ravine. Her murder went unsolved until 2004, when advances in DNA technology linked her case to a man who was already in prison for killing another woman. Turns out he was a serial killer who had killed 4 women, some of whom had been raped. N.M. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Alexander Wayne Watson. Murderpedia. Org. Male. With Watson Alexander. HTM. That the Lusitania did indeed have munitions on board when she was sunk in 1915 by a German U-boat, making her a legitimate military target. The British government always insisted she was just a passenger liner and denied there were any munitions on board. However, in 1982, the head of the Foreign Office's American department finally admitted that, although no weapons were shipped, there is a large amount of ammunition in the wreck, some of which is highly dangerous and poses a safety risk to salvage teams. N. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. RMS Lusitania. The identity of Deep Throat, the Watergate whistleblower that eventually led to Nixon resigning. Not the porn, you pervs. His identity was secret for 31 years, until 2005 when he was identified as Mark Felt, an FBIAD, who had come down with dementia when it was revealed, not by him. Hey. N. M. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Deep Throat. Watergate. The Death Valley Germans. N. M. Wikipedia. Org. Wiki. Death Valley Germans. There is a very comprehensive report, detailing years of investigation. Chupacabra has been pretty much explained by a guy who investigated it for 5 years and wrote a book called Tracking the Chupacabra. Long story short, the initial eyewitness thought the movie Species was a documentary. Most subsequent sightings' bodies were wild animals that looked weird because they had mange. Roman concrete that resisted seawater, and the missing Roanoke colony. The lost recipe for the concrete turned out to be something we misinterpreted, and the Roanoke colony was abandoned because the settlers decided to live and mix with the natives. DNA tracing was able to connect this. Adventures with Purpose. A great YouTube channel where a group of divers find missing people underwater after years when the local authorities don't care anymore or just don't have the resources. Lyle Stevick. Surprised he isn't here yet. He was the case of a man who hanged himself in a motel in Amanda Park, Washington in September 2001. He signed into the hotel under the name Lyle Stevick, not his real name, and he was found dead in his room, hanged in the closet, with money left for the room and a note that just said, "Suicide." No other identifiable information was found on him. Police investigations at the time did not produce any results. He was only identified in 2018 via DNA analysis, but his family chose not to reveal his true identity. My greatest mystery was who took a sit on the hood of my car. For years I could not figure who did it. I was at a party with my friends and when I went to leave there was a loaf pinched on my car. So ages later I am a groomsman at my buddy's wedding, and we jeer our gifts in these little bags. And on mine is a card. It seems safe today to tell you I sit on your car. So back then we weren't as close and we had someone we knew who had the same name. Basically he mixed up which one of us frocked his girlfriend and he was loaded at the party and decided to lay down some revenge. Chelsea Bruck's murderer. A girl went to a Halloween party dressed as Poison Ivy, not knowing that it would be her last party. Chelsea Bruck was last seen alive on the 31st of October with a man in costume in the wee hours. 3 weeks later, she was found dead in an empty field. Police were unable to identify the mystery man for almost 2 years but finally arrested Daniel Clay in the summer of 2016. Investigations led to Daniel's girlfriend, who claims that Daniel confessed to her about the heinous crime he committed a couple of years ago. Daniel faced a tough jury, which sentenced him a daunting punishment of life sentence. It is believed that Daniel escaped the capital punishment as he was only charged with second-degree murder. Once lost my bank card the day I got it. 5 years later upon moving out I found it stuck to the bottom of a lamp. Mysteries from the show Unsolved Mysteries that were solved after their respective episode aired. Link. The murders of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Cuylenborg. A couple from Victoria, BC went on a short trip to Washington state in 1987 and were murdered. It remained unsolved until 2018 when a genetic match from the semen found on Tanya was found. The story was of interest to me as I live in Victoria and remember the story on the news when the murder happened when I was a young kid. Between 2010 and 2015, I actually worked with her younger brother. He grew up and became a lawyer. Very nice guy and was so happy for him when they announced it was solved. In 1970, a new dinosaur was named Dinosaurus mirificus, which basically meant, weird horrible hand, because all they had of it were a pair of massive arms. 4 meters long. Until 2014, when new specimens were discovered. Nobody had a clue what it looked like or what it did with its life, but we now know it looked like a long-armed giant spoonbill with a camel hump. Nice. Edited just to confirm. Its beak wasn't quite spoonbill length, proportionately, but the essential shape is much the same. The location of Forrest Fenn's treasure. The eccentric antiquities dealer, grave robber, hid a box of valuables worth $1 million in the Rockies. He released a poem in an autobiography that contained clues to its location. I believe it stayed hidden for over 10 years until it was located in 2020. I have always wanted to vacation out in the Rocky Mountains, Yellowstone area, and looking for the treasure was a big part of what I wanted to do while I was there. How the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. A French architect figured it out. They used an internal ramp system. Some of the turn stations for the ramps are still there. Really quite brilliant. The solution does not disappoint. What happened to the 68 Ford Mustangs used in the Steve McQueen movie Bullitt? For decades, car enthusiasts and Mustang fans wondered if they were still around somewhere or had been crushed like a lot of movie cars. Fortunately, both were found. One ended up in a junkyard in Mexico and was turned into an Eleanor replica. The other one, the stunt car IIRC, was garaged by its owners since the 80s after some mechanical problems. Here's the article. Car and driver. Features. A1945741. Original Steve McQueen Bullitt Mustang rediscovered. Late to the party. Q Lazarus, who recorded The Haunting. Goodbye Horses. That was later included in the soundtrack for Silence of the Lambs. Was a mystery for many years. It turns out that she recorded exactly 2 singles. Retired from music. And is now a bus driver. The Burning Skier in the Malcolm in the Middle opening titles. U2. BYFRWXIRZVRW. April Tinsley case. The little 8-year-old girl was found murdered in April of 1988. They recently made an arrest in 2018 due to genetic DNA testing. Here is an article about the case and arrest. Not a long-lasting mystery, but given the era and what it paved the way for is pretty interesting. I read about this in a book called First Platoon recently. First murder solved by a fingerprint. In 1892, the double murder of 2 children in Argentina was the first ever successful investigation of a homicide using fingerprinting. Atlantis isn't real. The story is an allegory in Plato's works that fit right within Greek sensibilities and interests, incorporating things the Greeks would have known about intimately and with interest, like authors are wont to do. He also just made stuff up that was never there. Because he could be a wily dig. There are lost cities and structures in the ocean, but they are not Atlantis. There is this weird notion that ancient people were stupid, and this leads to a kind of literal interpretation and broad, reductive generalizing of their beliefs that are clearly, provably false, but exist nonetheless. Ancient people knew what metaphors and other artistic techniques are, and it actively harms progress to be reductive about the past and dishonest in the present. The case of the star KIC 8,462,852's inconsistent light patterns. At first, people couldn't figure out why there was this fluctuation in the star's light and were considering the possibility it might be a Dyson sphere built by an alien civilization. A Dyson sphere is a hypothetical structure built around a star to capture as much of its light as possible. But then they concluded that dust is probably the reason behind the fluctuation, since new data showed that different colors of light are being blocked differently, which indicates that what's blocking the light isn't opaque like a Dyson sphere. The disappearance of Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, author of The Little Prince. He was a pilot and disappeared on a reconnaissance mission in 1944. They finally pieced a few things together in the early 2000s. The saddest part is the Luftwaffe guy who shot him down had idolized him as a child. NY Times. The 11th of April 2008, World, Europe, 11 Exupéry. HTML. The blue D6 that my sister always wanted to use was actually weighted to roll 6 more often.